black mechanic struggling fixed a billionaire's jet on the runway. She proposed to him on the spot. Laughter echoed through the sleek high-end hangar at Westlake International Airport as Marcus Jennings parked his old, rusty pickup truck along the private runway. The 38-year-old mechanic, hands scarred from years of work, unloaded his battered toolbox, oblivious to the murmurs behind him. Through the tinted glass windows of the VIP terminal, executives in perfectly tailored suits exchanged looks of disbelief, their eyes narrowing with judgment. Is this the expert they called for Mrs. Evans' jet? Richard Hastings, the director of operations at Evans Aerospace, sneered. He didn't bother to hide his contempt. I thought we asked for the best technician in the area, not someone who looks like he just rolled out of a roadside repair shop. Marcus heard the words, but let them wash over him. This was nothing new in his life. People had always doubted him based on his appearance, his background, and the color of his skin. What they didn't see was the skill beneath his rough exterior, the precision and brilliance of his work. He'd saved more luxury aircraft than all the certified technicians at this airport combined, his hands earning him national awards for technical excellence. But none of that mattered when it came to the way people saw him. He caught the eye of the runway supervisor, who nervously approached him. Mrs. Evans' jet needs to take off in 2 hours. Our technicians haven't been able to identify the problem. If you don't fix it in time, we'll have to call the Atlanta team. Marcus nodded silently, walking toward the Gulfstream G650, a $65 million machine gleaming under the early morning sun. As he approached, he felt the weight of all those eyes on him from the terminal windows. Critical eyes, judgmental eyes, but then one pair of eyes stood out. A gaze that wasn't laced with disdain, but something else, recognition, perhaps? Let him work. A calm female voice cut through the silence, commanding attention. Alexandra Evans, the CEO of Evans Aerospace and the owner of the jet, emerged from the terminal. She moved with purpose, her navy blue suit a sharp contrast to her immaculately styled brown hair. She didn't spare a glance for her staff or the executives who had been observing Marcus. Instead, she locked eyes with him. "How much time do you need?" she asked, her voice cool, but not unkind. Her watch, more expensive than Marcus' entire annual salary, gleamed in the sunlight. "It depends on the problem, ma'am," Marcus replied, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "You have 1 hour," she stated, checking her watch again. "Impress me." The executives retreated back into the comfort of the terminal, leaving Marcus alone with the jet and the clock ticking in his mind. As he opened the main access panel, the weight of the task became clear. This wasn't just a simple mechanical failure. The pressurization system had failed catastrophically. What the other technicians had mistaken for a minor electrical issue was actually life-threatening. If the jet took off in this condition, the cabin would depressurize at 45,000 feet, and everyone on board would be dead before they knew what hit them. His hands moved quickly, almost instinctively. He didn't have time for anything but pure focus. He was saving lives, but no one knew that. Not the executives watching him from behind glass, not the runway supervisor pacing nervously, and certainly not the corporate world that had dismissed him for years. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of Alexandra Evans standing in the terminal. Her gaze wasn't critical like the others. It wasn't filled with doubt. It was different, focused, almost calculating, but definitely not disdainful. 30 minutes passed, and Marcus, having worked with the speed and precision only years of experience could provide, closed the panel. He wiped his hands on a rag, picked up his tools, and began packing them away. The job was done. No thanks were necessary. To him, doing the job right was just the baseline expectation, the bare minimum. For someone like him, perfection was simply expected, not celebrated. But then Alexandra Evans came out again, walking toward him with a purpose, her staff trailing behind, clearly puzzled by the sudden turn of events. She ignored the staff's questioning looks and focused only on Marcus. How long would it have taken them to discover the real problem? She asked, her voice steady but probing. They would never have found it, Marcus replied bluntly. The jet would have crashed with everyone on board before they figured it out. There was a long, heavy silence as she stared at him, her gaze searching, calculating. Finally, she nodded, as if coming to a decision. "Come with me," she ordered, surprising everyone, especially Richard Hastings, who stood at a distance watching the exchange with a growing look of discomfort on his face. At that moment, Marcus had no idea that this simple request would not only change his life but would disrupt an entire industry. It wasn't just about a jet being fixed or lives being saved. It was about to become something much bigger, a confrontation with prejudice, with recognition long overdue, and with a truth that had been hidden for years. As Marcus followed Alexandra Evans across the tarmac, He had no idea that this was only the beginning of a journey that would expose a web of deceit and injustice hidden in plain sight. And in the next few moments, the power structures of an entire industry would begin to unravel. This wasn't just about saving a jet. This was about to be the beginning of Marcus Jennings' story, one that would change everything. The walk from the jet to the terminal was long, and in the silence that stretched between them, Marcus felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't sure why Alexandra Evans had called him to follow her, but he had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just about the jet anymore. Alexandra led him through a secure part of the terminal, past offices and corridors few employees had access to. Her presence was commanding, and every step she took was filled with purpose. It wasn't until they reached a private office at the end of the hallway that she spoke again. "Take a seat," she said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite her desk. She closed the door behind them, cutting off the world outside. The office was sleek, high-end, a combination of luxury and practicality, but it didn't feel like the kind of place Marcus was used to. He sat down, his hands still gripping the edge of the chair, his mind racing. Alexandra slid into the chair behind her desk, pulling out a tablet. "Did you tell me your full name?" she asked, tapping something into the device. "Marcus Jennings," he answered. A slight pause. Alexandra's gaze sharpened as she glanced down at her tablet, her fingers scrolling quickly. Her eyes flicked up to meet his. There was something in her gaze, a flicker of realization. "Marcus Jennings," she repeated, her voice soft but filled with weight. "MJ." Marcus stiffened slightly, but kept his expression neutral. He had learned long ago to hide his emotions in situations like this. "I've seen these initials before," she continued, her eyes narrowing as she typed more. "On the original designs for our G7 pressurization system." Marcus didn't flinch. The G7 system. The one that had brought Evans Aerospace millions in profits. The one Richard Hastings had taken full credit for. The one that had cost him his career 5 years ago. Alexandra's eyes widened, but she masked her surprise quickly. You designed the G7 system?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch out, letting her take in the weight of the revelation. Finally, he spoke. "I did," he said, his voice steady. "I was an engineer at Evans Aerospace. I designed the G7 pressurization system, revolutionized it, really. And 3 days after I submitted the complete design, I was fired. Told I was technically incompetent. They escorted me out of the building like a criminal." The room fell silent. Marcus could feel the tension thickening in the air as Alexandra's eyes searched his face. She wasn't just surprised by the truth. She was processing it, as if she was trying to make sense of the pieces that didn't fit into the story she had been told. "And Hastings," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Hastings took credit for it." Marcus nodded. He did. The G7 system saved the company hundreds of millions in fuel costs and maintenance. And Richard Hastings got all the glory. All the promotions. He even got a bonus for my work. Alexandra leaned forward, her brow furrowing. "But why? Why didn't you fight it? Why didn't you take credit for your work?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the memory of those years still sharp in his mind. "Because no one hires a black engineer from the suburbs to lead development teams, Ms. Evans," he said quietly. "And mechanics have bills to pay." Alexandra's expression softened, but there was something else behind her eyes now, a fire, a determination. She reached into a drawer, pulling out a file. As she opened it, she skimmed through the documents inside, her fingers turning the pages slowly. "These are the corporate records," she said, looking up at Marcus. "The G7 system. Hastings' signature all over it. But then I see this." She slid a few sheets of paper across the desk, and Marcus took them without hesitation. He read through the documents quickly. His stomach churned as he saw the names of the other engineers, the ones who had been fired under similar circumstances. All of them had contributed significant innovations. Yet all of them had been dismissed, their contributions erased, their ideas stolen. It wasn't just Marcus. It was a pattern. Alexandra's voice broke through his thoughts. This wasn't just you, Marcus. This was systematic. 7 other talented employees, Black and Latino, fired for technical incompetence, all shortly after contributing major innovations. Marcus let out a bitter laugh, feeling the weight of the years of injustice crashing over him. And all of them were erased. Like we never existed. Alexandra stood up and began pacing, her eyes intense. This can't stand. I can't let this go on. And neither can you. Before Marcus could respond, there was a knock at the door. Without waiting for an invitation, Richard Hastings entered, his face a mask of faux concern. His eyes immediately locked onto Marcus, and for a moment, the tension in the room was palpable. Alexandra, Hastings said, his voice smooth, the board is waiting for you. We need to discuss the quarterly report, and he stopped mid-sentence when he saw Marcus sitting in the office. His expression hardened. What's he doing here? Alexandra's eyes didn't leave Hastings as she responded calmly. The service is complete, Richard. We were discussing the G7 system, specifically the intellectual property. Hastings' face paled, but he quickly recovered, forcing a laugh. A mechanic discussing intellectual property? That's absurd. He was just an assistant technician. Alexandra didn't flinch. I have here the original G7 designs, signed by you. But what's more interesting is that they have the initials MJ. Marcus Jennings, she said, her voice icy now. The same Marcus Jennings who worked briefly in the development department 5 years ago. Hastings froze, his usual composure slipping. That's impossible. Marcus didn't design the G7 system. It was my team. Is that so? Alexandra's voice was sharp as she interrupted him. Her eyes locked onto his. I also have emails here from you to HR, recommending Marcus' dismissal for technical incompetence, just 3 days after he submitted the complete G7 project. Richard Hastings' face turned crimson, the mask of concern replaced by a deep, seething anger. Alexandra, this is ridiculous, he said, forcing a smile. We don't have time for this. The board is waiting, and... Alexandra stood up, her gaze unyielding. You're temporarily relieved of your duties, Richard. Please hand your badge to security. You're suspended pending the internal investigation. Hastings blinked in shock, his anger boiling over. You can't do this. The board won't allow it. The board will be informed in an hour, Alexandra said coldly. And if you want to retain any shred of dignity, I suggest you leave now, before I have security escort you out. Hastings' face twisted in fury, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. Alexandra took a deep breath, then turned to Marcus, her expression now softer, more determined. We're just getting started. Marcus sat silently for a moment, processing what had just happened. He had never imagined his life would change in this way. But now, with everything out in the open. The door to Alexandra Evans' office clicked shut behind Richard Hastings, leaving an eerie silence in the room. Marcus remained seated, his mind still reeling from everything that had just unfolded. In the space of a few minutes, his life had been irrevocably changed. He had gone from being a faceless mechanic to a key player in an investigation that could bring down one of the most powerful men in Evans Aerospace. Alexandra sat back down behind her desk, her expression resolute. She opened her tablet again, scrolling through more documents. There was a determination in her eyes, but there was something else, something Marcus had noticed earlier, a quiet understanding, as if she had been waiting for this moment, too. Marcus, she said, breaking the silence, I need your help. What we're dealing with here isn't just about you or the G7 system. This is bigger than that. I've been investigating a pattern of discrimination and intellectual theft within my company for years. Your case, your story, is just the most visible example. Marcus' brows furrowed. His curiosity piqued. What do you mean? You've known about this for a while. Alexandra looked up, meeting his gaze directly. I've been suspicious for a long time, but I never had the proof. It wasn't just your design that was stolen. There were others before you, and I suspect there are more after you. Richard Hastings has built his entire career on appropriating the work of talented employees, people who don't look like him. Black and Latino engineers, technicians, their ideas, their innovations, all taken without recognition, without compensation. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Marcus felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone in this fight. That this wasn't just about him proving his worth. It was about dismantling an entire system that had allowed people like Richard Hastings to thrive at the expense of others. How long has this been going on? Marcus asked, his voice low. Years, Alexandra replied, her voice filled with quiet anger. But now we have proof. You have proof. We can expose this, but I need your help. I need you to stand with me. Marcus hesitated. He had spent 5 years in the shadows, biding his time, repairing jets while his ideas were stolen. The idea of stepping into the spotlight, of putting himself at the center of a battle against the corporate world, was daunting. But he knew this wasn't just about the G7 system anymore. It was about every person who had been erased, their work dismissed because of who they were. I'm in, Marcus said finally. But how do we bring this all to light? Hastings has connections everywhere. He controls half the board. How do we fight that? Alexandra smiled, a hint of steel in her eyes. We expose everything. We need irrefutable evidence, and we have it. We're not just fighting for you, Marcus. We're fighting for every person who's been wronged, who's been overlooked, who's been pushed aside. As she spoke, the door to the office opened, and a woman entered. She was middle-aged, with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority. She carried a thick briefcase, which she set down on the desk before nodding at Marcus. Marcus, this is Dr. Sophia Chun, Alexandra said. She's our chief legal officer and the person who's been helping me dig into the records. Sophia, this is Marcus Jennings. Dr. Chun extended her hand to Marcus, her expression warm but focused. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Jennings. I've been following your case closely. I've already confirmed that the G7 system and a number of other innovations were stolen from you and from others. Marcus shook her hand, still processing the enormity of what was happening. Thank you, he said quietly. I didn't think anyone would care. We care, Dr. Chun replied, her tone firm. And we'll make sure this is exposed. But we need your help. We need you to go through these documents with us. Help us track the patterns of theft and discrimination. The more we know, the stronger our case will be. Marcus nodded. I'll help however I can. Alexandra's gaze softened, but there was still a fire in her eyes. I know this isn't easy, but we're not doing this alone. We have each other. As the three of them sat down to go through the documents, Marcus felt the weight of the moment sink in. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. He wasn't just a mechanic in the background. He was a part of something much larger, a movement that could change the course of not only his life, but the future of Evans Aerospace. The documents were painstakingly detailed. Dr. Chun had compiled a comprehensive investigation into the company's history of intellectual property theft. There were emails, meeting notes, and internal memos that exposed the systematic nature of the thefts. The evidence was irrefutable. Marcus found himself poring over pages of records, his eyes scanning the familiar names of engineers, many of whom he had worked with years ago. Some of them had been his mentors, others were his peers. Yet all of them had been pushed out of the company, their contributions erased, their work attributed to others. Hastings had been the mastermind behind it all, manipulating the system to keep credit for ideas that were never his. After hours of sifting through the documents, Alexandra closed her tablet and turned to Marcus. We're ready, she said. The next step is to take this to the board. We can't just expose Hastings without making sure the board is on our side. They need to know the truth, and they need to know that this isn't just your story. This is a pattern of systemic theft. Marcus nodded. And what happens to Hastings? Alexandra's expression hardened. He's not going to get away with this. But we need to be strategic. We'll present the evidence carefully. Make sure the board understands the full extent of what's been happening. We can't let him spin this into a personal attack on you. We need to show them the bigger picture. The next 2 weeks were a blur. Alexandra, Dr. Chun, and Marcus worked tirelessly, gathering more evidence and preparing their case. The investigation into the company's culture of discrimination and theft grew deeper with each passing day. But despite the mounting evidence, Marcus knew they were running out of time. The shareholders' meeting was approaching fast, and they needed to be ready to present their findings. As the day of the meeting drew closer, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty. He had spent so long in the shadows, so long being dismissed by those in power, that it was hard to imagine a world where he could stand up and demand justice, not just for himself, but for all the others who had been silenced. But he also knew something else. This was his chance. This was his moment to make sure the world knew the truth. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. The day of the meeting arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Marcus stood beside Alexandra in the boardroom, feeling the weight of the room's gaze on him. The executives who had once laughed at him, who had doubted his abilities, were now silent, watching him closely. It was time to expose the truth. As Alexandra began to speak, outlining the investigation and presenting the evidence, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of power rising within him. This was more than just a fight for recognition. This was about dismantling a corrupt system and creating a future where talent, regardless of background or skin color, could thrive. This wasn't just his story anymore. This was the beginning of something bigger, a revolution within Evans Aerospace and beyond. The room was filled with an uneasy silence as Alexandra Evans presented the evidence. Marcus stood beside her, his eyes scanning the faces of the board members and executives seated around the table. It wasn't lost on him that many of these people had once mocked him, laughed at his appearance, and questioned his competence. But now, as the carefully curated documents were laid bare, as the emails and memos were read aloud, the faces of those same executives shifted. Subtle shifts, but undeniable. Alexandra spoke with unwavering authority, outlining the systematic theft of intellectual property and the culture of discrimination that had permeated Evans Aerospace for years. Her voice was calm, measured, but every word carried the weight of justice long overdue. As you can see, Alexandra said, pointing to a slide that displayed a timeline of events, the pattern is clear. Multiple engineers, many of whom were talented Black and Latino employees, were terminated after submitting groundbreaking innovations. Their work was either stolen outright or credited to others, most notably Richard Hastings. There was a collective stir among the board members, but none dared to interrupt. Alexandra continued, showing the emails that linked Hastings to the unjust firings and the fraudulent appropriation of intellectual property. The room was now filled with a murmur of disbelief and shock. And here, Alexandra added, flipping to the next slide, we have evidence from 5 years ago when Marcus Jennings submitted the complete design for the G7 pressurization system. 3 days later, he was fired for technical incompetence, despite the fact that his system became the backbone of Evans Aerospace's success. Marcus could feel the tension in the air, the weight of every eye on him. But he stood tall, steady. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when the truth came to light. And he wasn't going to let fear hold him back. Alexandra turned to him, her voice soft but firm. Marcus, would you like to share your side of the story? For a brief moment, the room fell silent. Marcus took a deep breath, his hands gripping the sides of the table. This was it. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore. He was speaking for all the people who had been silenced, erased, and forgotten. I've been a mechanic at this airport for 5 years, Marcus began, his voice steady but filled with quiet intensity. I've fixed more jets than I can count. But what no one knew, what no one bothered to ask, is that I also designed some of the most innovative systems this company has ever seen. And 5 years ago, when I submitted my design for the G7 system, I thought I was doing something good. Something that would change the industry. But instead, I was fired, humiliated, and erased. He paused, locking eyes with the board members. Richard Hastings, the man who took all the credit, has been stealing from people like me for years. And you all sat back and let it happen. The room was still, but Marcus could see the flicker of discomfort in some faces. It was clear that many were shocked, but others, particularly those who had aligned themselves with Hastings, looked uneasy, caught between the weight of the truth and the loyalty they had once pledged. But the tension didn't last long. Dr. Sophia Chun, who had been silently observing the proceedings, spoke up. Her voice was sharp, but filled with quiet power. "I have something to add," she said, turning to the board. "We've confirmed that Richard Hastings has been manipulating the company's internal systems for years. He's been rewarding himself with promotions and bonuses for work that he did not do. The patents for the G7 system, for instance, were filed under his name, even though Marcus Jennings is the true inventor. And this pattern isn't limited to just one system. It's been happening across multiple departments." The room fell silent once again. The faces around the table were hard to read, but it was clear that the truth was sinking in. There was no denying it anymore. Hastings had been systematically stealing from his colleagues, and the entire board had turned a blind eye. Hastings himself, who had been conspicuously absent up until this point, suddenly appeared in the doorway. His face was tight with anger, his eyes blazing. He strode into the room, his usual smug confidence replaced by a defensive, almost frantic energy. "What is this nonsense?" Hastings barked, his voice laced with a thin veneer of control. "I demand to know why I'm being accused of these ridiculous claims. Marcus Jennings, he's just a mechanic. He was never even part of the development team. This is absurd." Alexandra didn't flinch. She met his gaze with unwavering calm. "I think you need to listen carefully, Richard. We've already presented the evidence. The truth is undeniable. And we're not backing down." Hastings' face reddened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You can't do this. You're jeopardizing everything this company has worked for. I made Evans Aerospace what it is today." Alexandra stood, her voice cold and final. "No, Richard. You took what others built, and you profited from it. You used your position to manipulate the system, to steal from people who were more talented than you. The truth is, you're not the reason this company is successful. Marcus Jennings is." The silence in the room was palpable, broken only by the sound of Hastings' labored breathing. He stood there, mouth agape, unable to process the enormity of the situation. Finally, it was Marcus who spoke. His voice was steady, but there was a quiet anger behind it. "You'll never understand, will you?" Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. "You've spent your whole life taking credit for things you didn't do, pushing people like me to the side. But now the truth's out. And you can't hide behind your lies anymore." Hastings took a step forward, but the room collectively bristled. A few board members shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Dr. Chun, standing near the back, spoke up again. "Richard Hastings, you are hereby suspended pending an internal investigation into your actions. Your access to company records is revoked. We've already begun contacting the authorities." Hastings froze, his face a mask of disbelief. "You can't do this. The board will." "The board has been informed," Alexandra cut him off. "They're on our side now. You've lost. And so has everything you've built on the backs of others." The room went quiet. Marcus felt a sense of vindication, but it wasn't a victory he could savor just yet. There was still work to be done. There were still systems to dismantle, policies to change, and people to uplift. As Hastings stormed out of the room, shouting threats and curses, Marcus turned to Alexandra and Dr. Chun. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. "We're not done yet," Marcus said, his voice firm with resolve. "There's more to fix, more to change." Alexandra smiled, a look of respect in her eyes. "I know. But this was a good start." The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, media coverage, and internal investigations. The truth of Richard Hastings' actions spread like wildfire through Evans Aerospace. He was eventually dismissed from the company, facing multiple lawsuits, and his reputation was shredded beyond repair. But Marcus' fight wasn't just about exposing Hastings. It was about creating a future where others like him would never have to face the same kind of injustice again. In the aftermath, Evans Aerospace underwent a transformation. The company began implementing new policies that recognized the contributions of every employee, regardless of their background. They established mentorship programs for marginalized groups, ensuring that no one would ever be overlooked again. As for Marcus, his position as the Director of Innovation wasn't just a title. It was a symbol of what was possible when talent, hard work, and integrity were valued above everything else. He had proved that the system could be changed. And as he stood in the company's newly established Diversity and Innovation Center, surrounded by bright, young engineers from every walk of life, he knew the fight wasn't over. But they were on the right path. And the future was theirs to shape. The months that followed Richard Hastings' fall from grace were a whirlwind of change. Evans Aerospace was no longer the same company it had been. The corporate culture, once rife with systemic discrimination and intellectual theft, was slowly but surely being rebuilt from the ground up. The internal investigation had revealed a staggering number of injustices, but it had also ignited a fire for reform within the company. Alexandra Evans, now more resolute than ever, led the charge. And at her side, Marcus Jennings was no longer the invisible mechanic he had once been. He was the face of a new era for Evans Aerospace, one built on transparency, fairness, and, most importantly, recognition of talent regardless of background. Marcus had never imagined that the day he fixed that billionaire's jet on the runway would be the catalyst for such a monumental shift. He had been content to remain in the background, quietly doing his job, making a living. But now, as the newly appointed Director of Technological Innovation, Marcus was at the helm of a revolution that was reshaping the future of aviation. The corporate restructuring wasn't just about optics. It was about real change. Real opportunities for people like Marcus, people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or erased. Under his leadership, Evans Aerospace began implementing new diversity initiatives, mentorship programs for minority groups, and a dedicated fund for innovation from historically marginalized communities. They even created a community technology development center in the neighborhood where Marcus had grown up, an effort to inspire the next generation of engineers from the same streets that had once limited his opportunities. In the grand conference room, where Marcus had once been ridiculed by executives who didn't believe in his ability, he now sat at the head of the table. The room, which had once felt foreign and intimidating, was now a place where new ideas flowed freely, and voices that had once been silenced were now being heard. One of the first projects under Marcus' leadership was the development of a new propulsion system that promised to reduce fuel consumption in commercial aircraft by 40%. The team was diverse, engineers of all races, genders, and backgrounds, coming together to solve one of the biggest challenges in the industry. Marcus was no longer the lone genius in the corner. He was part of a collective that was changing the industry. As Marcus sat in his office, looking out over the tarmac, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. It wasn't just the job or the title that mattered. It was the impact he had on the people around him. The young engineers who had once been invisible were now in positions of power. He had opened doors for them, and they were walking through them with a kind of pride and confidence that had been denied him for so long. Yet, as much as he had achieved, Marcus knew the work wasn't done. The scars of his past, years of discrimination, of being overlooked, hadn't magically disappeared. But he had turned those wounds into a weapon for change. He had taken the rejection, the injustice, and transformed it into something powerful. And now, with each new innovation, each new success, he was proving to the world that talent, no matter the color of your skin, could no longer be ignored. Alexandra had never doubted him. From the moment she'd walked across that runway to ask him to join her, she had seen something in him that no one else had. She had given him a chance, and together, they had dismantled the systems that had kept so many like him down. She was a different kind of CEO, one who believed in doing things the right way, even when it was difficult. But it was clear now that her belief in Marcus wasn't just professional. She saw the potential in him, not just as an engineer, but as a leader. And when she had asked him to merge his small engineering company with Evans Aerospace, Marcus had hesitated. The idea of merging was foreign to him, especially when it came to a company that had once overlooked him. But Alexandra had been clear. It wasn't just a merger of business, it was a partnership, one that would give him a platform to continue his work on his own terms. Looking at the blueprint for the next phase of the G7 successor, Marcus felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just his work, it was the work of a team. A team that had been given the tools, the resources, and the support to flourish. A team that had proven that diversity wasn't just a buzzword, it was the key to innovation. The door to his office opened, and Alexandra stepped inside. She smiled when she saw him lost in thought, the same calm determination in her eyes that had driven her from the start. "You're thinking about the future again, aren't you?" she asked. Marcus smiled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, I guess I am." She walked over to his desk, glancing at the blueprints and notes in front of him. "This new propulsion system is going to change everything. But what you're really changing is the whole industry. You're proving that it's not just the systems we build, but the people we build them with that make the difference." Marcus nodded. "I never imagined this kind of change could come from one moment, from one decision. But now, I'm starting to believe that real change takes time, it takes patience. It's about building something that lasts, something that can't be erased." "And you're doing it," Alexandra said. "You've turned the pain of the past into a platform for the future." There was a moment of silence between them. The weight of everything they had accomplished, everything they had fought for, settled in. But they both knew that the journey wasn't over. There was always more work to do. More lives to change. More barriers to break down. "I think the best part of all this," Marcus said finally, "is seeing the next generation. The kids from my old neighborhood, they've got opportunities now. They're not being told they can't do it. They're being shown that they can." "That's the real victory," Alexandra replied. "And you're giving them the tools to do it." Later that afternoon, Marcus stood in front of the newly established Evans Aerospace Community Technology Development Center. The center, located in the same neighborhood where he had once struggled to find a way out, was now a place of hope, a place where young minds could learn, grow, and innovate without the barriers he had faced. The center's walls were lined with prototypes, designs, and projects that represented the future of technology and the future of aviation. As he watched the students work on their projects, he saw something in their eyes that mirrored the feeling he had once had as a young engineer, the belief that anything was possible. These kids, these young engineers, were going to change the world, just as he had. And they weren't going to face the same barriers he had. He knew that his success, his rise from mechanic to director, was only part of the story. The real story was the opportunity he had helped create for others. And that was worth more than any title, any paycheck, or any invention. The sound of footsteps behind him broke his reverie. It was his mother, Mrs. Jennings. At 72, she was as strong as ever, her eyes full of pride as she stood next to him, taking in the scene before them. "You did it," she said softly. Marcus smiled, feeling the weight of her words. "We did it, Mom. All of us." And as he looked around at the young engineers working alongside him, at the community he had helped build, he knew that the true victory wasn't just in the innovations they were creating. It was in the fact that no one would ever have to fight as hard as he did to be seen again. The fight for justice, for visibility, had just begun. And with the people he had surrounded himself with, there was no limit to what they could accomplish. For the first time in his life, Marcus Jennings was truly free.